Standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid or tracing your fingers along the delicate gold filigree of a medieval relic, it's hard not to wonder how. How did hands without power tools carve stone with such precision? How did eyes without microscopes create patterns so intricate they still leave us breathless today? These aren't just questions about technique. They're a window into the extraordinary minds of the artisans who shaped history, one painstaking stroke at a time. Their masterpieces weren't just built, they were dreamed, problem-solved, and willed into existence with nothing but ingenuity and relentless patience. And that's the real mystery, not just what they created, but how they saw the impossible and made it real. Think about the last time you tried something with your hands, maybe assembling furniture or painting a room. Now imagine doing it without a single modern convenience, without even the certainty that your methods would work. That's the world these craftsmen lived in. Yet somehow they turned rough stone into soaring cathedrals, melted sand into stained glass that glowed like jewels, and forged metals so pure they've survived centuries of wear. Their tools were simple chisels, hammers, rudimentary kilns, but their understanding of materials, physics, and even chemistry was anything but. They listened to the whisper of the wood, the groan of the stone, and adapted in ways that still baffle experts today. This is more than a story of forgotten techniques. It's a testament to human tenacity. Every chip of marble, every brushstroke on a Renaissance fresco was a battle against limits, time, resources, even gravity itself. And yet they persisted. Why? Because beauty and precision weren't just goals, they were obsessions. So join me as we step into their workshops, dusty and sunlit, and uncover the secrets they left behind. From the scaffolding hidden in cathedral walls to the lost wax casting that birthed immortal statues, we'll unravel how these artisans turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. By the end, you won't just admire their work, you'll feel the echo of their hammers in your hands, and maybe, just maybe, see the world a little more like they did, full of possibilities waiting to be carved out. Imagine spending your teenage years doing nothing but sweeping workshop floors or stirring vats of pigment, not as punishment, but as privilege. That was the reality for apprentices in Renaissance Florence or medieval Kyoto, where earning the right to hold a chisel could take a decade of proving your devotion. These weren't just students, they were living sponges, absorbing every flick of their master's wrist, every muttered curse at a stubborn block of marble. The apprenticeship system wasn't about fast-tracking talent. It was about slow crafting mastery, layer by layer, until the skills became as instinctive as breathing. Take the stained glass artisans of Chartres Cathedral. Before a young apprentice was allowed near a single piece of colored glass, they'd spend years preparing lead strips, bending, cutting, and fitting them until their hands could measure thickness by touch alone. Only then would they graduate to assembling small sections, always under the watchful eye of a master who'd correct the slightest misalignment with a tap of a wooden mallet. This wasn't just training hands, it was calibrating eyes to see light and shadow in ways most of us never will, and it wasn't just technical skill being passed down. In Japanese sword smithing workshops, apprentices learned to read the weather, waiting for humid days to fold steel because the metal responded differently. In Persian carpet weaving, they memorized hundreds of dye recipes using plants harvested under specific moon phases. These weren't superstitions, they were generations of observation etched into muscle memory. A master potter in ancient China might spend hours teaching an apprentice how to wedge clay, not just to remove air bubbles, but to feel when the material reached the perfect state of surrender. This intimate, lifelong transfer of knowledge created something modern education often misses: a reverence for the process itself. When you've spent 5 years stretching canvases before ever picking up a brush, you don't see painting as a series of steps. You see it as a conversation between hand, heart, and history. That's why so many of these apprentices became innovators themselves. They didn't just replicate techniques, they understood them deeply enough to bend the rules. Michelangelo's first teacher made him draw nothing but charcoal sketches for 2 years. By the time he touched marble, his hands already knew how to chase forms out of stone. The loss of this immersive training is why some ancient techniques still baffle us today. We might replicate the chemical composition of Roman concrete, but without centuries of masons whispering tricks about volcanic ash ratios or seawater mixing, we're missing the intuition behind the recipe. That's the real magic of apprenticeship. It wasn't just teaching how, but teaching why. And in that slow, sacred transfer of wisdom, ordinary materials became extraordinary. Those seemingly simple chisels and mallets were extensions of the artisan's own hands, worn smooth by generations of use, their handles shaped to fit palms like old friends. A master stone carver didn't just swing a hammer. He felt the rebound in his wrist, knew exactly how the blow would travel through the tool and into the marble. The difference between a jagged fracture and a clean cut, often just the angle of the chisel, adjusted by fractions of a degree, and these weren't one-size-fits-all tools. A Venetian glassblower might own dozens of specialized tweezers, each bent at a unique curve to manipulate molten glass at different stages of cooling. A Japanese joinery master kept chisels so sharp they could pare wood thinner than a strand of silk, their edges maintained with stones finer than modern sandpaper. Consider the bronze casters of Benin, who sculpted wax models with knives heated to precise temperatures too cool, and the wax would tear, too hot, and details would melt away. They worked without thermometers, judging heat by how the wax curled away from the blade, a language of touch and timing passed down through centuries. Or take the shipwrights of ancient Phoenicia, who shaped hull planks with adzes so perfectly balanced they could shave wood to the thickness of a coin, creating ships watertight enough to cross oceans. These weren't crude implements, they were precision instruments refined over lifetimes. The real magic lay in how these tools were used together. A cathedral stonecutter might switch between 5 chisels in as many minutes, a toothed punch for roughing out shapes, a flat blade for sweeping curves, a pointed pick for delicate veins in leaf carvings. Each change was instinctive, like a chef selecting knives without looking, and the sharpening rituals were almost sacred. Swedish blade smiths still whisper about the morning edge, a blade honed at dawn, when the light was just right to reveal microscopic imperfections. That attention to detail meant a single chisel could last decades, its steel slowly wearing down like a sculptor's own fingerprint. What modern power tools gain in speed, they often lose in dialogue with the material. A diamond saw cuts marble in straight lines, but it can't feel when the stone's grain is about to split. A medieval carver, though, would pause mid-stroke at the slightest resistance, rotating the block to find a new approach. That's why so many ancient carvings seem to breathe. Their creators weren't just removing stone, they were uncovering forms hidden within, guided by whispers only their hands could hear. The tools were simple, the mastery was anything but. The precision of ancient builders wasn't just impressive, it was mathematical poetry in motion. Picture a team of Egyptian artisans laying out the foundations of the Great Pyramid with nothing but palm fiber ropes and wooden pegs. Their secret, the royal cubit, a standardized unit etched into rods of black granite, each subdivision marked with the care of a jeweler. This wasn't rough estimation. It was a system so exact that modern laser measurements revealed deviations of less than 2 millimeters across entire sides of the pyramid. And they did it all without a single steel tape measure. Then there were the Gothic master builders who turned geometry into a kind of sacred language. Their compasses weren't just tools, they were keys to an invisible grid of proportions. Take the rose windows of Notre Dame. Their intricate tracery wasn't drawn freehand but plotted using compass arcs and straightedges, with every curve calculated to distribute weight perfectly. The templates for these designs were often guarded like state secrets, passed down within guilds alongside tricks for compensating for material shifts in the stone. A mason might adjust a cut by the width of a blade if he noticed the limestone had a hidden flaw, blending math with intuition in a way no digital caliper could replicate. Even more astonishing were the Incan builders who fitted multi-ton stones together so tightly you couldn't slip a hair between them, their measuring system. Knotted strings called quippers, which encoded lengths and angles in a code of colors and knots. While we still haven't cracked all their meanings, the results speak for themselves: terraces and walls that have withstood earthquakes for centuries. Meanwhile, in India, temple architects used a proportional system called the Vastu Purusha Mandala, laying out sacred spaces with ropes and pegs in precise ratios believed to harmonize with cosmic forces. What united these methods across continents and eras was a deep understanding of materials as living partners in the process. A medieval mason didn't just measure stone, he listened to it. If a block resisted his chisel, he might adjust his proportions on the fly, trusting his trained eye over rigid numbers. That's why so many ancient structures feel alive. Their precision wasn't cold or mechanical, but a dance between human intention and the quirks of wood, stone, and metal. Today, we can 3D print a replica of a Gothic gargoyle in hours, but we're still decoding how the original carvers made it seem to breathe with nothing but a mallet and a lifetime of patience. Ancient artisans didn't just work with materials, they communed with them. Take the vibrant blues of Renaissance frescoes, made from crushed lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan. To extract that celestial hue, craftsmen mixed the stone with melted wax and kneaded it through linen, a process so laborious it made ultramarine pigment more expensive than gold. Yet the payoff was eternal. Centuries later, those blues still glow as if lit from within, while modern synthetic pigments fade. This wasn't just painting, it was alchemy turning rock into light. Then there's the mystery of Roman concrete. While our modern structures crumble after decades, their harbor walls endure after 2,000 years in seawater. The secret: volcanic ash from Pozzuoli, mixed with lime to create a mortar that actually strengthens over time. Scientists only recently discovered its magic: tiny mineral crystals that grow when saltwater seeps in, knitting cracks back together. The Romans called it pulvis puteolonus, treating it like a living thing that needed the right conditions to thrive. And who could forget Damascus steel? Swordsmiths in medieval Syria folded and reforged their blades up to 50 times, creating microscopic layers that made the metal both flexible and razor-sharp. Legends claim these swords could slice through falling silk scarves, a feat modern metallurgists still can't perfectly replicate. The missing ingredient. Trace elements from Indian wood steel ore, a recipe lost when the mines ran dry. But perhaps the most astonishing transformation happened in Chinese kilns. Celadon porcelain owes its jade-like glow to iron oxide in the clay, which turns sea green only when fired in a precise oxygen-starved environment. Potters would watch the kiln's flame color like alchemists, adding damp wood at the exact moment to create the perfect reducing atmosphere. One misstep and the entire batch would emerge dull brown. these weren't random experiments, they were the culmination of generations observing how materials behaved under fire, pressure, and time. A Byzantine glassmaker knew exactly how lead made glass heavier and more refractive, while a Mayan plasterer understood that adding tree sap created a waterproof finish. Every masterpiece was a collaboration between human ingenuity and the hidden potential of Earth's raw gifts. We may have advanced tools today, but we're still rediscovering the wisdom in their fingerprints. Perfection wasn't a destination, it was a cycle of endless refinement. Picture a Benedictine monk hunched over a vellum page in the flickering candlelight, his quill hovering as he copies sacred texts. One misplaced letter, and he doesn't just cross it out. He reaches for a pumice stone, gently scraping away the ink until the parchment is bare again, risking tears in the delicate animal skin. This wasn't mere correction, it was an act of reverence. A single manuscript might take years to complete, with some scribes wearing grooves into their desks from the rhythm of scraping and rewriting. Now shift to the quarries of medieval Europe, where masons squared blocks for cathedral walls with nothing but iron chisels and plumb lines. If a joint didn't fit flush, they didn't wedge in mortar to hide the gap, they recut the entire stone, even if it meant days of extra labor. The proof is in the buildings themselves. Run your hand along the walls of Chartres or Canterbury, and you'll struggle to find seams wider than a blade's edge. These craftsmen weren't just building, they were solving three-dimensional puzzles in stone, where every miscalculation meant starting over. And then there were the potters of ancient Japan, who embodied perhaps the most radical philosophy of all. In the Raku tradition, masters would deliberately remove finished tea bowls from the kiln while still glowing hot, quenching them in water to create crackled glazed patterns. But if the cracks didn't align with the artist's vision, they'd smash the piece without hesitation, grinding the shards to reuse the clay. To an outsider, it might seem wasteful. To these artisans, it was the only way to honor the materials, by refusing to let anything less than their ideal survive. This obsession with perfection wasn't about pride or even craftsmanship alone. It was rooted in something deeper, the belief that their work spoke across centuries. A mason carving a gargoyle new rain would erode his details over time, but he still cut every feather on a dragon's wing as if it would last forever. A scribe illuminating a Bible in gold leaf understood his name would fade into history, but he painted each saint's halo with the precision of someone signing his soul into the work. What's astonishing isn't just their tolerance for repetition, it's their redefinition of failure. Every scraped parchment, recut stone, or shattered bowl wasn't a mistake. It was a necessary step in an unspoken dialogue between artisan and material. Modern tools might let us edit with a keystroke or sand a surface in minutes, but something profound gets lost in that efficiency. The understanding that true mastery lies in the space between almost and there. Geometry wasn't just a tool, it was a sacred dialect whispered through stone and stained glass. In the hands of medieval artisans, a simple compass became a key to the cosmos, tracing patterns that mirrored the orbits of planets and the symmetry of snowflakes. Take the hypnotic arabesques of the Alhambra's walls, where infinite star and polygon tessellations unfold without a single repeating sequence. Muslim craftsmen followed strict geometric rules, believing these endless interlocking shapes reflected the infinite nature of creation itself. They worked without algebra as we know it, yet their tilework demonstrates an intuitive grasp of mathematical concepts Europe wouldn't formalize for centuries. Cross continents to Ireland, where 9th century monks twisted pen nibs into labyrinths of interwoven beasts, Celtic knots weren't mere decoration, they were meditations on eternity with no beginning or end. Using only dividers and grids, scribes plotted these complexities so precisely that modern scanners reveal deviations of less than half a millimeter. The Book of Kells' famous Cairo page hides a secret. Zoom in on any swirling border, and you'll find smaller, perfect knots nested inside like fractal echoes. This wasn't doodling, it was devotion made visible, each curve a prayer penned in geometry. But nowhere was this marriage of math and mysticism more breathtaking than in Gothic cathedrals. Rose windows like Chartres' North transept are essentially stone mandalas, circular theorems in colored light. Master glaziers divided the circle using the vesica piscis, that almond-shaped intersection of two overlapping circles sacred to medieval geometers. The 12 lancets radiating outward, they mirror both the apostles and the zodiac, while the precise angles of tracery distribute the window's massive weight so perfectly that many have survived hurricanes and wars. What's astonishing isn't just their precision, but their philosophy. These artisans saw geometry as a bridge between earth and heaven. When a Byzantine architect planned the Hagia Sophia's dome, he didn't just calculate its curvature, he designed it to symbolically represent the firmament, with 40 ribs echoing the days of Lent. In Tibet, monks still create sand mandalas using centuries-old geometric grids, destroying them afterward to honor impermanence. Whether in Islamic mosaics or Navajo weaving, this universal language of shapes reveals a truth. Before blueprints existed, before CD software, humans spoke fluently in the silent poetry of angles and arcs. Their masterpieces weren't just built, they were solved like divine equations carved in wood and stone. The human body wasn't just a tool, it was the first precision instrument, calibrated over millennia of trial and error. Picture a potter in ancient Mesopotamia pressing her thumb into a coil of wet clay, leaving a groove exactly the width of her fingernail. That tiny impression became her ruler, ensuring every vessel had walls of consistent thickness. No calipers, no gauges, just the intimate knowledge that her own body never lied. Across cultures, artisans internalized these measurements until they became second nature. A Japanese swordsmith knew the exact moment to quench molten steel by the heat radiating onto his cheek, while a Navajo weaver counted warp threads by the span between her outstretched hand and opposite shoulder, a living tape measure passed down through generations. This embodied wisdom turned apparent limitations into ingenious solutions. Medieval glassmakers couldn't measure the viscosity of molten silica, so they blew through pipes until the glass's resistance matched the feeling of exhaling through pursed lips, a sensory benchmark as reliable as any modern rheometer. Shipwrights along the Nile fitted planks by chewing the ends of papyrus ropes to soften them, their teeth leaving bite marks that doubled as alignment guides. Even something as mundane as a carpenter's breath became a tool. Breathing onto a dry tenon swelled the wood just enough for a friction fit, a trick still used by luthiers shaping violin necks today. What seems like improvisation was actually refined science. When Gothic masons carved intricate foliage capitals, they didn't rely on protractors. They used the angle between their outstretched thumb and pinky to gauge curvatures, a biological compass honed through repetition. Inuit soapstone carvers judged material density by the sound of a knuckle tap, while Persian rug makers tied knots at speeds matched to their heartbeat rhythms. These weren't shortcuts, they were deep collaborations between craft and physiology, where calluses became calibration marks and muscle memory replaced instruction manuals. The tragedy of modern tools is how they've divorced us from this visceral connection. A digital angle finder gives a number, but it can't replicate the way a seasoned woodworker feels a dovetail joints fit in the bones of her hands. We've gained precision but lost something profound, the understanding that our ancestors didn't just make things with their bodies. They thought, measured, and even dreamed through them, turning skin and sinew into the ultimate multipurpose tool. Their legacy whispers in every handmade object that still fits perfectly in human hands, shaped by hands that knew no separation between art and anatomy. Ancient builders didn't fight against nature, they danced with it, turning seasonal rhythms into silent partners in their craft. Picture a team of medieval masons trekking to limestone quarries in the dead of winter, their breath fogging in the crisp air as they pried blocks from frost-hardened beds. This wasn't hardship, it was strategy. Cold temperatures kept the stone's internal moisture locked in place, reducing cracks that might form during extraction in warmer months. By spring, those quarried blocks would be ready for carving, their crystalline structure stabilized by months of patient drying in shaded yards. Meanwhile, shipwrights along the Baltic coast timed their timber harvests to the waning moon, believing correctly that sap levels were lowest then, yielding wood less prone to warping or rot. Modern science confirms it. Trees felled in winter have up to 20% less moisture, making them lighter and more stable for construction. Summer wasn't just a season for building, it was a chemical ally. Roman engineers mixed their famed hydraulic concrete during drought months, knowing the Mediterranean heat would accelerate the lime's curing process, creating bonds so strong they've outlasted empires. Over in Japan, carpenters working on Shinto shrines planned their joinery for late summer's humidity, when wooden pegs would swell into perfect friction fits, tightening like nature's own clamps as the air grew damp. Even something as simple as plaster gained intelligence with the seasons. Gothic artisans applied their final coatings in early autumn, when cooling nights and mild days prevented the mixture from drying too fast, a lesson learned the hard way after centuries of cracked frescoes. But perhaps the most poetic synchronization happened underground. In the silver mines of Potosi, indigenous miners waited for the dry season to extract ore, not just for easier digging, but because they'd noticed veins shone brighter under certain atmospheric pressures. Their tunnels followed seasonal humidity gradients, exploiting natural ventilation patterns that modern engineers now replicate with electric fans. From the Andes to Angkor Wat, these artisans weren't just observing nature, they were decoding its hidden logic, turning environmental constraints into creative fuel. A monsoon wasn't a delay, it was a signal to switch tasks, to polish stones indoors or weave ropes from rain-soaked fibers. This wasn't superstition, it was deep empiricism refined over generations. When Byzantine glassmakers harvested beach sand after winter storms, they weren't following tradition blindly. They'd learned that wave action sorted grains by size, yielding silica of perfect consistency for crucibles. Chinese lacquer artists collected tree sap only between the solar terms of grain rain and summer solstice, when the resin's viscosity made it self-leveling on wooden panels. Every material had its season, its moment of perfect readiness, and the true master wasn't the one who worked fastest, but the one who knew when to wait. What modern construction gains in climate control, it often loses in this dialogue with the elements. We pour concrete in January with chemical accelerants, force dry lumber in kilns, and wonder why our materials lack the resilience of a timber frame that's weathered 7 centuries. There's wisdom in the way a 15th century mason might pause his work because the morning dew made his chisel slip, or how a Navajo weaver chose winter nights for spinning when the cool air kept wool fibers supple. These artisans didn't see time as an enemy to outpace, but as a teacher whose rhythms held the secret to endurance. Their greatest tool wasn't the chisel or the loom, it was patience, the kind that listens to the whisper of frost forming on stone and understands exactly what it means. The workshop wasn't just a place of sight and touch, it was a symphony of hidden sounds, each note a clue to the material's secrets. A master blacksmith didn't need a thermometer to know when his iron was ready for the anvil. As the metal heated, it sang a low hum at first, rising to a shimmering chorus as the crystalline structure transformed. The moment before quenching, the iron reached a high, clear tone like a struck bell, a signal passed down through generations of smiths who'd learned to trust their ears as much as their eyes. Glassblowers in Murano operated by a similar auditory instinct. Molten silica has a voice, a faint, glassy ring when the gather on the pipe reaches the ideal viscosity for shaping. Too thick and the sound dulled, too thin and it vanished into a watery whisper. These craftsmen didn't just blow into pipes, they listened, adjusting their breath to maintain the precise pitch that meant the glass was ready to dance under their tools. Even the cooling process had its own music. A perfectly annealed piece emitted a subtle chime when tapped, while hidden stresses revealed themselves as discordant notes, warning of future cracks. And then there were the masons, their mallets tapping cathedral walls like doctors percussing a chest. Each hollow thunk or crisp ring mapped the stone's integrity beneath the surface. In Jerusalem's quarries, workers struck raw blocks with wooden mallets, selecting only those that resonated with a deep, clear tone proof of uniform density. A flawed stone betrayed itself with a flat, muffled response, no matter how flawless it looked. This acoustic wisdom extended to textiles too. Silk weavers in Hangzhou judged thread tension by the rhythmic creak of their looms, while Japanese papermakers stirred vats of mulberry pulp until the slurry made a specific sloshing sound too thick and it gurgled, too thin and it hissed. Even the humble shoemakers all had its own language, the squeak of leather resisting versus the clean whisper of a perfect stitch. What's heartbreaking is how much of this sonic literacy has faded. Modern laser thermometers and ultrasonic testers give precise readings, but they don't teach us to hear the soul of the material. There was poetry in the way these artisans moved through their workshops, not just as makers, but as conductors, orchestrating a dialogue between themselves and the elements. The next time you hear a potter's wheel whirring or a blacksmith's hammer ringing, close your eyes. Beneath the noise, you might just catch an echo of that old, forgotten language, the sound of craftsmanship itself. Failure wasn't the end, it was the first page of a master's textbook. When a Gothic cathedral's vault collapsed at Beauvais in 1284, sending tons of stone crashing to the ground, the masons didn't hide their miscalculations. They studied the rubble like archaeologists, measuring fracture lines and noting where the mortar had crumbled. These weren't secrets locked away, they became part of an oral syllabus passed to apprentices, warning generations about the dangers of pushing height without enough buttressing. That fallen arch taught Europe how to build higher not through success, but through catastrophic, humbling failure. Half a world away, Japanese swordsmiths practiced an even more radical form of education through disaster. A newly forged katana wasn't just tested on straw targets. It was subjected to brutal bending trials recorded in meticulous ledgers. If a blade snapped, the smith preserved the fragments, etching the breakage pattern into the tang as a permanent record. These failure swords became sacred teaching tools, studied alongside flawless examples so apprentices could see how grain structures reacted under stress. The guilds didn't worship perfection. They revered the intelligence hidden in cracks and fractures. Even the most mundane materials held lessons. Roman concrete mixers kept notes on which batches crumbled in seawater, discovering over centuries that volcanic ash from Pozzuoli made their mortar indestructible. Persian rug weavers deliberately knotted flawed sections into masterpieces, not as mistakes, but as visual reminders of which dye combinations bled or which wool tensions caused puckering. These weren't hidden away, they were displayed prominently, turning errors into maps for future craftsmen. The brilliance of these systems lay in their honesty. Unlike modern engineering, where failures are often buried in corporate archives, medieval guilds treated disasters as communal property. A Venetian glassblower's furnace explosion would be recounted in guild halls from Damascus to Bruges, each retelling adding nuance about clay crucible compositions or cooling rates. Chinese porcelain masters maintained death books documenting thousands of cracked celadon vessels, with annotations about kiln temperatures and weather conditions on firing days. These weren't just records, they were living conversations across time, where every shattered piece whispered clues to those who knew how to listen. Perhaps the most profound lesson was in their definition of progress. Today, we expect linear improvement, each version better than the last. But these artisans understood mastery as a spiral, where revisiting old failures with new eyes could unlock breakthroughs. The same Byzantine dome that collapsed in 558 due to inadequate piers became Hagia Sophia's revolutionary design 50 years later because someone had preserved the accounts of that disaster. Real advancement wasn't about avoiding mistakes, it was about curating them, studying their jagged edges until they revealed a path forward. In their workshops, broken things held as much wisdom as finished masterpieces, maybe more. Cathedrals didn't rise from solitary genius, they were born from the hum of 1,000 hands moving as one. Picture the building site of Chartres or Canterbury, masons shouting measurements across scaffolding, glassmakers holding up freshly cut panes to daylight for approval, carvers passing stone fragments down a human chain like bucket brigades. This wasn't just teamwork, it was a living organism where every artisan, from the master architect to the apprentice mixing mortar, became a single cell in a greater body. Unlike modern construction with its rigid blueprints, medieval workshops thrived on fluidity. A master glazier might take one look at a finished window and demand the stone tracery be recut because the light hit differently than expected, and the masons would adapt without hesitation, their chisels already moving before the words finished echoing. The secret wasn't just skill, it was a shared language of craft that transcended individual egos. In the lodge books of Strasbourg Cathedral, you'll find no singular designer credited. Instead, generations of masons left coded sketches in the margins, each adding adjustments based on what the stone itself revealed as they worked. A 15th century buttress might bear the fingerprints of 20 different carvers, yet the foliage spirals seamlessly as if shaped by one hand. This collective mindset extended to materials too. Quarrymen selected blocks knowing glassmakers needed specific limestone compositions to hold stained glass, while blacksmiths forged joint pins to the exact thickness carvers requested. Every decision rippled through the community like vibrations in a spider's web. Compare that to today's siloed creativity, where an architect's CD file gets passed to engineers who never meet the welders assembling their designs. Medieval workshops had no such divisions. When the lead sculptor at Rheims Cathedral noticed his apostles' faces were shadowed at noon, he didn't file a change order. He grabbed a mason's hammer and reshaped the arch above them on the spot. Guilds enforced this interdependence through rituals. In German stonemason lodges, initiates drank from a shared brother cup engraved with compass and square, symbolizing that no member's work stood alone. What's most astonishing is how these collaborations birthed innovations no single mind could have conceived. The flying buttress, that iconic Gothic leap of faith, wasn't some master architect eureka moment. It emerged gradually from countless conversations between masons worrying over cracked walls and carpenters rigging temporary supports. Even the cathedral's very layout reflected communal wisdom. The north side sculptures are slightly more abstract because those artisans worked in shadow, adapting their style to the light they had. These weren't compromises, they were conversations in stone where every voice left its mark. We've gained individualism but lost the alchemy that happens when skilled hands think together. Modern 3D printers can replicate a Gothic pinnacle in hours, but they'll never capture the way a 13th century carver's adjustment to a saint's robe might inspire a glassmaker to shift his palette 2 bays down. That's the real magic of the cathedral builders, not just what they made, but how they listened, responded, and elevated each other's work until the boundaries between crafts blurred into something transcendent. The stones remember their names, even if history forgot them. The loom wasn't just a tool, it was an altar. In the highlands of Peru, Quechua weavers still begin each day by whispering prayers to Pachamama, their fingers stroking the warp threads like sacred strings. Every knot tied carries not just wool, but intention, stories of harvests, prayers for rain, memories of ancestors. This wasn't superstition, it was a way of weaving the invisible into the tangible. Across the world, Japanese swordsmiths purified their forges with Shinto rituals, scattering salt and chanting as they folded steel, believing the blade would absorb their focus. The result, katanas so revered they were given names and passed down like living heirlooms. Consider the stained glass artisans of medieval Europe. Before touching a single piece of cobalt or ruby glass, they'd fast for a day and attend mass, preparing their minds as carefully as their materials. The light streaming through their finished windows wasn't just decoration, it was divine geometry made manifest, each color vibration calculated to evoke specific spiritual states. Even the humblest crafts carried this reverence. Norwegian woodworkers carved runes into the undersides of chairs, not for decoration, but to weave protection into the grain itself. A child's cradle might bear symbols for strength, its rockers shaped during a waxing moon when the wood was believed to hold resilience. This ceremonial approach transformed routine actions into acts of devotion. Tibetan monks creating sand mandalas meditate for hours before picking up their metal funnels, aligning their breath with each grain of colored sand they place. The act isn't rushed, it's a moving prayer, destroyed upon completion to honor impermanence. Similarly, Navajo weavers leave deliberate spirit lines in their rugs, thin pathways of contrasting thread that allow the weaver's energy to escape rather than becoming trapped in the pattern. The flaw isn't a mistake, it's a sacred release valve. What modern workshops lose in efficiency, they gain in sterility. A factory-produced tapestry may be technically flawless, but it carries none of the whispered blessings woven into a Persian carpet where each knot corresponds to a verse from the Quran. The difference is palpable. One decorates a wall, the other seems to breathe with centuries of faith. Even the tools themselves were sanctified. Byzantine mosaicists anointed their tesserae with holy water, while Celtic metalworkers buried finished brooches in bogs overnight, letting the land bless the metal. These weren't empty gestures, they were bridges between matter and meaning. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in how these rituals shaped the artisans themselves. Chanting over a potter's wheel or singing quarry songs in rhythm with hammer blows wasn't just about the object being made. It was about the maker's transformation, the way repetition and reverence turned craft into meditation. A Balinese gamelan maker still tunes his bronze gongs by ear during specific planetary alignments, believing the cosmos imprints harmony into the metal. Whether or not the stars affect the alloy's resonance is beside the point. What matters is the smith's utter presence, his hands moving as extensions of something far older than himself. In a world obsessed with speed, these slow ceremonies remind us, true mastery lives in the spaces between actions, where intention and material whisper secrets only the devoted can hear. The greatest artisans didn't just use nature, they collaborated with it, turning beehives into time capsules and oxblood into architectural glue. Take Renaissance painters grinding pigments with walnut oil, a process so slow it took months to cure, but resulted in varnishes that still gleam after 5 centuries. Unlike modern synthetic resins that yellow and crack, these plant-based films deepened in transparency as they aged, the oil's molecules aligning into crystalline structures that scattered light like prisms. Over in China, lacquer masters harvested sap from toxicodendron trees, applying layer after painstaking layer, each one requiring a week to harden in humid chambers. The result: boxes and screens that withstand boiling water and resist acids modern plastics can't touch, all because artisans understood how to harness nature's patience. Then there were the masons who turned animal byproducts into alchemy. Oxblood wasn't just symbolic, it contained serum albumin proteins that, when mixed with lime mortar, created molecular bonds stronger than cement. Gothic cathedral builders used this concoction in their most vulnerable joints, and today, those blood-infused seams often outlast the surrounding stone. Beeswax played a similar role in encaustic painting, where Egyptian artists blended it with resin to preserve Fayum portraits. Buried for 2 millennia in desert tombs, these faces still glow with uncanny vitality because the wax's hydrophobic properties repelled microbes and moisture alike. What's astonishing isn't just their material choices, but their deep ecological intuition. Before the term sustainability existed, these craftsmen practiced radical resourcefulness. Japanese joiners saved the Oroshi lacquer tree's toxic sap by using badger hair brushes that could be rinsed and reused for decades. Venetian glassmakers recycled every speck of glass dust into new batches, while Navajo weavers spun yarn from plants most would consider weeds: rabbitbrush, milkweed, even tumbleweeds, each fiber chosen for specific tensile strength. Modern science is now catching up to their wisdom. Researchers at Cambridge recently discovered that iron particles in medieval ink derived from oak galls and rust actively repair parchment by strengthening collagen fibers. Meanwhile, the iron-rich oxblood mortar has inspired new bioconcrete formulations using hemoglobin from slaughterhouse waste. These artisans weren't just making do, they were pioneering circular economies where every byproduct held potential. A broken pottery shard became a sculptor's rasp, fallen feathers transformed into the finest gilding brushes, and even fireplace soot was treasured as the purest black pigment. Their legacy whispers a challenge to our disposable age. What if we saw materials not as commodities to consume, but as partners in creation? When a 15th century painter needed verdigris pigment, he didn't just buy a tube. He suspended copper plates over vinegar vats for months, watching as the metal slowly transformed into emerald crystals. That intimacy with process is what's missing from most modern workshops. We might have stronger adhesives, but we've forgotten how to listen to the quiet genius of a walnut slowly surrendering its oil, or the way beeswax remembers every fingerprint pressed into its golden surface. Perhaps mastery wasn't just about controlling materials, but learning to think like them, to understand that real endurance comes not from dominating nature, but from dancing with its rhythms. Those wooden joints holding up temples for 1,000 years, they're feats of engineering disguised as simplicity. Take Japan's Horyuji Temple, built in the 7th century without a single nail. Its interlocking brackets, called Tokyo, aren't just clever woodwork, they're seismic genius. Each joint flexes during earthquakes like a tree bending in wind, dissipating energy through intricate layers of cypress fingers that tighten under pressure. Modern architects only recently decoded why these structures survive quakes that topple steel skyscrapers. The wood's natural elasticity and the precise gaps between joints create a built-in shock absorption system no computer could fully simulate. Across the Alps, medieval European carpenters had their own hidden brilliance. A blackened timber barn in Switzerland might look rustic, but its dovetail joints are cut to micrometer precision, not with lasers, but with hand-calibrated marking knives. The trick: they seasoned the wood for decades before cutting, letting it reach equilibrium with local humidity so the joints would self-tighten as the climate shifted. Some frames were even assembled in winter when wood was at its most contracted, ensuring summer expansion would lock everything immovably. These builders didn't fight nature's changes, they weaponized them. But perhaps the most humbling examples come from China's dugong brackets. Stacked wooden arms support pagoda roofs weighing tons, yet they slot together like 3D puzzles. The secret lies in what's not there: no glue, no metal, just friction and perfect geometry. When the Yingxian pagoda weathered 9 centuries of storms, scholars found its dugong joints had compressed over time into even denser stability. Like a wine improving with age, the structure grew stronger through its own graceful yielding. What unites these traditions is their quiet rebellion against modern assumptions. We think innovation means adding complexity, more gears, more wires, more code. Yet these artisans achieved near magical durability through subtraction. A traditional Norwegian, Lafteverk, log cabin's corner notches repel water because the overhanging wood grain directs rainfall like 1,000-year-old gutters. A Balinese rice barn's bamboo pegs swell at dawn's humidity, locking joints tighter by midday. Even the humble mortise antennon, found from Egyptian chariots to Viking longships, outlasts rivets because wood moving against wood creates a living bond where metal would fatigue and crack. The lesson isn't that old ways are better, but that they speak a different language, one where solutions emerge from patient dialogue with materials. A CNC router can carve perfect joints in minutes, but it can't replicate the way a master carpenter selects timber by tapping for hidden harmonics, or adjusts angles based on how morning light reveals a fiber's twist. These seemingly simple creations weren't designed, they were cultivated, grown from an intimacy with organic behavior we're only now relearning through biomimicry. The next time you see an ancient beam still standing after centuries, look closer. That unassuming wood holds whispers of a forgotten science, where true sophistication wore the disguise of simplicity. The smallest masterpieces held entire universes in a few square inches. Mughal court painters worked with brushes made from a single squirrel hair, their hands steadied by resting on a wooden bridge to avoid even a micron of tremor. One errant stroke could ruin weeks of work, especially when painting the delicate irises of a prince's portrait or the individual petals of a jasmine flower smaller than a grain of rice. Yet these artists didn't see miniatures as lesser creations. A single folio from the Panorama might depict a royal hunt with 300 distinct faces, each no larger than a poppy seed, yet alive with expression. The secret: brushes so fine they were stored in protective cases carved from hollowed-out bird bones, and pigments ground for days until they flowed like liquid silk. Half a world away, Norse artisans were proving scale meant nothing when it came to storytelling. A Viking craftsman might spend months carving a thumbnail-sized amulet, his knife tip sharpened to near molecular fineness. On that tiny surface, entire sagas unfolded: dragons with individually scaled wings, ships with rigging thinner than spider silk, even the wrinkles on Odin's brow as he sacrificed his eye for wisdom. These weren't just decorations, they were portable magic, believed to hold power precisely because of their impossible detail. Archaeologists still marvel at the Gotlandic picture stones, where a space the size of a coin might hold a fully realized battle scene, complete with shield textures and flying arrows. What united these traditions was a philosophy where mastery wasn't measured in square footage, but in how much life could be compressed into the tiniest canvas. Chinese seal carvers etched entire poems onto jade plaques smaller than a fingernail, their characters readable only under magnifying lenses. Renaissance goldsmiths fabricated lockets with moving parts, tiny clockwork birds that sang when opened, their mechanisms smaller than a sesame seed. Even in monumental cultures like ancient Egypt, the most revered objects were often the smallest. Scarab amulets with hieroglyphs so precise they've been mistaken for micro-engravings. This reverence for the miniature reveals a truth about craftsmanship we often forget. Constraint breeds genius. When every stroke is irreversible and every millimeter matters, there's no room for hesitation. A Byzantine enamelist laying gold wire onto a crucifix the size of a pea couldn't rely on sketches. The design lived in their muscle memory, their hands moving with the certainty of a calligrapher writing in the dark. Modern technology lets us shrink designs digitally, but these artisans achieved their precision through something no software can replicate: the marriage of infinite patience with absolute confidence. Their tiny masterpieces whisper that true artistry isn't about the space you fill, but the world you can conjure within the space you're given. The glow of stained glass and the gleam of gold leaf came at a price few modern eyes can fathom. Medieval manuscript illuminators often worked by dim candlelight, their faces inches from vellum as they traced hair-thin lines with squirrel hair brushes. Over years, their vision blurred into permanent myopia. Some scribes' spectacles excavated from monastic ruins have lenses ground to the equivalent of negative 15 diopters. The famous Lindisfarne Gospels weren't just illustrated, they were literally written with failing eyes, each spiraling Celtic, not a testament to devotion that measured progress in millimeters per day. Glassmakers faced darker consequences, those brilliant reds in Venetian goblets, achieved by adding gold chloride to molten silica, a process that released mercury vapors with every stir. Artisans developed glassblower's palsy, their hands trembling uncontrollably from chronic heavy metal poisoning, yet still coaxing liquid crystal into impossible forms. In China's imperial workshops, jade carvers inhaled fine silicate dust that scarred their lungs like shards of glass, while Renaissance fresco painters mixing lead white pigment slowly poisoned themselves stroke by stroke. Caravaggio's dramatic chiaroscuro may have been influenced by the tunnel vision creeping in from years of toxic exposure. The body kept score in other ways too. Gothic stone carvers working overhead on cathedral scaffolds developed permanent spinal distortions. Archaeologists can identify their skeletons by the asymmetrical wear on vertebrae. Japanese sword polishers kneeling for hours on tatami mats wore grooves into their kneecaps over decades, their arthritic joints mirroring the rhythmic motion of sharpening steel. Even seemingly gentle crafts took their toll. Persian carpet weavers' fingerprints eroded from years of pulling wool knots tight, while lacemakers in Brussels went blind from stitching patterns finer than snowflakes. What's haunting isn't just their suffering, but their acceptance. Guild records show masters passing down remedies: linseed oil soaks for glassblowers' cracked hands, herbal poultices for stonemasons' bruised ribs, but never complaints. A Florentine goldsmith's journal captures this ethos perfectly. Lost 3 teeth to the mercury fumes this winter, but the chalice pleases His Holiness. These weren't martyrs, they were pragmatists who measured pain against legacy. When a Ming Dynasty porcelain painter went blind at 40 from squinting at cobalt blue patterns, his disciples recorded his pride that the emperor could still dine from bowls, brighter than the spring sky. Modern safety standards might recoil at such sacrifices, but they miss a profound truth these artisans understood. Some forms of immortality require trading mortal comfort. The stained glass still glowing in charters, the jade cups surviving dynasties, the samurai swords that still cut silk, they weren't made by cautious hands. Every masterpiece in this video carries invisible fingerprints of suffering, not as tragedy, but as the silent contract between creator and creation. Perhaps that's why we instinctively hold our breath before a Vermeer or a Bernini. We're not just seeing art, we're witnessing the shadow of what it cost to stop time. The Silk Road wasn't just about silk. It was the original internet, humming with the exchange of techniques as precious as any spice. Picture a Persian potter in the 9th century, crouched by a caravan campfire, watching a Chinese merchant unwrap a celadon bowl. That sea-green glaze, perfected in kilns a continent away, would soon ripple through Islamic ceramics, adapted into turquoise ware that adorned palaces from Samarkand to Baghdad. This wasn't mere imitation, it was alchemy across cultures. When Venetian glassmakers smuggled a Murano artisan to Germany in the 1500s, they weren't just sharing recipes, they sparked a revolution in forest glass that turned bohemian workshops into rivals. Even war became an unlikely teacher. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought more than relics. They carried the pointed arch, a design flourish from Moorish architects that would vault Gothic cathedrals to unprecedented heights. Consider the humble compass born from Chinese divination tools. By the time Arab traders introduced it to Mediterranean sailors, its needle had been reimagined in brass and housed in wooden boxes with wind roses painted by artists who'd never seen the sea. Knowledge transformed with every handoff. Spanish leatherworkers in Cordoba adopted Tunisian tanning methods using sumac leaves, creating Cordovan leather so supple it became the standard for European bookbinders centuries later. The transfer wasn't always peaceful. When the Mongols sacked Damascus in 1400. They spared the city's swordsmiths, transporting them to Konbalik to fuse Damascene patterning with Mongolian blade curvature. What's astonishing is how these exchanges reshaped materials themselves. Norwegian stave churches gained their dragon-headed eaves from Viking encounters with Chinese temple roofs, while Italian maiolica pottery borrowed its tin glazing technique from Islamic lusterware traded through Majorca. Even colors traveled. The vibrant Chinese red gracing Ming vases owed its brilliance to Persian cobalt, while the deep indigo of Japanese Edo period kimonos depended on fermentation techniques from Java. Globalization wasn't invented in boardrooms, it was forged in the workshops of anonymous craftsmen who recognized genius, no matter its accent. The real magic lay in adaptation. When Islamic architects encountered the Indian chaja, a stone sunshade, they reimagined it as the ornate muqarnas ceilings that seemed to drip like honey. Spanish metalsmiths blended Visigoth filigree with Nasrid arabesques to create the breathtaking monstrances of Toledo. Nothing was lost in translation, everything was enhanced. A single Florentine silk loom might combine Chinese sericulture, Syrian damask patterns, and Flemish dye chemistry, a tapestry of shared intellect woven across continents. These artisans didn't just borrow, they listened, experimented, and ultimately spoke in a visual language that belonged to everyone and no one. That's the untold story of craft. The masterpieces we admire were never solitary triumphs, but conversations in clay, glass, and stone that spanned generations and borders. The next time you marvel at a Gothic rose window or a Ming vase, remember, you're not just seeing an object, you're witnessing the first true World Wide Web. The greatest cathedrals weren't built from rigid plans, they grew from the minds of masters who carried entire structures in their heads like living blueprints. Walk the scaffolding of Notre Dame before the fire, and you'd find no modern engineering schematics, just rough sketches etched onto plaster walls or scribbled in the margins of prayer books. Those iconic flying buttresses, they weren't fully designed before construction began. Instead, they evolved as the walls rose, with masons adjusting angles based on how the stones settled, how the light struck the nave, even how the wind sounded whistling through unfinished arches. This wasn't improvisation, it was a kind of architectural jazz, where decades of ingrained knowledge allowed builders to compose as they went. Consider the lodge books of Strasbourg Cathedral, filled not with precise elevations, but with cryptic symbols and proportional diagrams that look more like alchemical formulas than construction documents. A single sketch might show a column's diameter as thrice the master's thumb, or a vault's curvature as the bend of a willow in spring. These weren't vague approximations. They were a visual shorthand for geometric relationships so deeply understood that the master builder could extrapolate an entire facade from a few key lines. When the original architect died mid-project, his successor didn't inherit a binder of CAD files. He absorbed the vision through these symbolic fragments and the whispered wisdom of senior masons. The proof lies in the imperfections. Laser scans of Gothic cathedrals reveal subtle asymmetries, buttresses that lean a few degrees more to the north, window tracery that's denser on the sunlit southern side. These weren't errors, but evidence of real-time problem solving. A master might notice cracks forming during a frost and thicken the next set of ribs without pausing to redraw plans. At Chartres, the famous labyrinth's path widens imperceptibly near the center, compensating for pilgrims' fatigue by offering more footing where steps grew heaviest. Such intuitive adjustments required a fluency in materials that no static blueprint could capture. This tradition of mental architecture stretches back millennia. The Romans built the Pantheon's revolutionary dome without detailed drawings, relying instead on proportional rules passed down through the collegium of builders. Byzantine masons constructing Hagia Sophia used knotted ropes to plot curves, adjusting the dome's profile based on how the mortar behaved hour by hour. Even the Inca's precision-fitted walls at Machu Picchu show no evidence of pre-planning, just an uncanny ability to visualize final forms while shaping each stone. What modern engineers might call working without a net, these artisans saw as the only way to truly collaborate with their materials. A Gothic mason didn't just carve stone, he conversed with it, letting the rock's hidden faults and grain dictate minor design shifts. Timber framers knew which trees had grown on windy hillsides would make stronger beams, adapting their joinery to the wood's unique personality. The loss of this adaptive mindset explains why modern restorations sometimes falter. We can replicate the measurements of a medieval rose window, but without the original builder's tactile intuition, the new versions often lack that ineffable harmony between structure and spirit. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson hidden in the missing blueprints. Mastery wasn't about executing a preconceived plan perfectly, but about developing the vision to recognize and embrace the better solutions that only reveal themselves in the making. When a 13th century mason stepped back to squint at an unfinished arch, he wasn't checking it against a drawing. He was listening, waiting for that silent moment when the stone itself would tell him where the next chisel stroke belonged. Japanese lacquer, where masters understood something we've nearly forgotten: time wasn't just a constraint, it was the secret ingredient. A single ceremonial bowl might consume half a craftsman's lifetime, its surface built from 30 painstaking layers of yorushi sap, each applied no thicker than a silk thread. Between every coat, weeks of waiting in humidity-controlled chambers where the lacquer cured not through chemical accelerants, but through a slow dance with the air itself. The result wasn't just a glossy finish, it was a metamorphosis. Over decades, oxygen and light transformed those layers into something almost alive, deepening the red into the color of aged wine, the black into the velvety darkness between stars. This patina couldn't be faked or rushed. It was the physical manifestation of patience, each crackle pattern a diary entry recording how the piece breathed with changing seasons. Compare that to our world of instant gratification, where even fast-drying crafts are deemed too slow. Modern epoxy resins achieve a superficial shine in hours, but they lack the soul of your rushy that grows more luminous as it ages. The difference is in the molecular poetry. Synthetic coatings sit inert on surfaces, while lacquer bonds chemically with wood fibers over years, creating a hybrid material stronger than either component alone. Kyoto's master lacquerers still store their works in underground cellars during monsoons, knowing the humidity will coax out deeper transparency in the resin. They don't fight time, they collaborate with it, trusting that a tea caddy finished in 1780 might reach its full glory just as their great-grandchildren inherit the workshop. This philosophy rippled through other slow crafts. Venetian mirror makers buried their glass in tidal flats for years, letting seawater gently etch away imperfections no grinder could detect. Persian miniaturists mixed pigments with cherry gum and then waited generations for oxidation to reveal their true vibrancy. A 16th century gold leaf might only now be reaching its peak warmth. Even the humble Japanese chisel followed this creed. Blacksmiths forged blades from steel folded 100 times, then hung them in smokehouses for decades so the carbon could stabilize. When a young carpenter finally inherited such a tool, its edge held memories of every temperature swing it endured, making it less likely to chip than factory-fresh alternatives. What's revolutionary isn't just their techniques, but their redefinition of progress. In an era obsessed with quarterly results, these artisans measured success in tree rings and lunar cycles. A Ming Dynasty potter might reject a kiln's entire batch because the clay hadn't found its voice yet, reburying it for another winter's frost to break down the fibers. Norwegian boat builders still season oak planks for 20 years before shaping them, knowing wood only reveals its true character after a decade of whispering with the wind. There's humility in this approach, an acknowledgement that some transformations can't be hurried, that mastery isn't just about human skill, but about becoming a steward for processes larger than oneself. The irony is palpable. Today's 3D printers can replicate a lacquer bowl's form in minutes, but the original remains irreplaceable because its beauty lies in the very thing we've erased, time itself. Those layers aren't just protective shells, they're the physical strata of a craftsman's lifetime, each stroke a meditation that no algorithm can simulate. When we hold such an object, we're not just touching art, we're holding a clock that ticks in centuries, a mirror showing us how much we've lost in our race against the hour hand. Perhaps true luxury isn't in the price tag, but in the audacity to let something take as long as it needs to become extraordinary. Walk through the halls of the Louvre or the British Museum, and you'll find masterpieces labeled unknown or workshop of. Not because they're lesser, but because their creators saw no need to claim them. The stained glass casting jewel toned light across Chartres Cathedral. No signature, the breathtaking ivory carvings of medieval Europe, rarely a name. These artisans didn't work in obscurity. They worked with a quiet understanding that the object itself was the testament, not the hand that shaped it. A Gothic stonemason might carve his personal mark, a tiny flower, a geometric cipher, into a hidden corner of a flying buttress, not for fame, but as a silent nod to the next craftsman who'd repair it centuries later. This anonymity wasn't accidental. In Japanese tea ceremony culture, the most revered bowls often bore the name of the dynasty that inspired them, not the potter. A Ming vase's value lay in its flawless glaze and form, not the fingerprints of the artisan who spun the clay. Even when names survived, like the legendary swordsmith Masamune, their prestige came from the blades that outlived empires, not self-promotion. Contrast that with today's art market, where a scribbled signature can inflate a canvas's price tenfold, regardless of skill. These unnamed masters posed a radical question. What if true craftsmanship isn't about leaving your mark on the world, but about leaving the world marked by your work? The irony is that their humility became their immortality. While we struggle to recall the kings who commissioned Gothic cathedrals, we still whisper about the master of the unruly curls, a nickname given to an anonymous 13th century sculptor whose cherub's hair seems to flutter in stone. Viking shipbuilders left no memoirs, but their longships' graceful curves still teach naval engineers about hydrodynamics. The lacquerware boxes gracing Kyoto's temples don't bear artists' names, yet their radiant surfaces have outlasted dynasties. Legacy, it seems, has a way of finding those who focus on the work rather than the credit. Perhaps this explains why so many ancient workshops operated as collectives. Persian carpet weavers worked side by side on a single rug, their individual stitches blending into a greater whole. Byzantine mosaicists passed tesserae down assembly lines, each hand contributing to sacred faces no single artist could claim. Even Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel's ceiling, often hailed as a solo triumph, relied on fresco specialists who mixed pigments and plaster to his exacting standards, their names lost to time. The cult of the lone genius is a modern invention. History's greatest creations were usually choruses, not solos. What's heartbreaking is how much knowledge vanished with these unnamed hands. The recipe for Roman concrete wasn't written in a treatise but lived in the wrists of mortar mixers who gauged volcanic ash ratios by texture. The blues of Chartres stained glass faded when the last apprentice who knew how to filter cobalt with oak ash died without heirs. Yet something profound lingers in this very impermanence, a reminder that art isn't a commodity to be owned, but a fleeting conversation across generations. When we stand before an unsigned medieval altarpiece, we're not meeting an ego, we're meeting the echo of a hand that cared more about the sacred than the signed. The next time you marvel at an ancient artifact, try this. Cover the museum label with your palm. Suddenly, you're not evaluating it by provenance or prestige. You're seeing it as its maker intended, judged purely by the language of form, material, and care. That's the quiet rebellion of these anonymous masters. They understood that while names fade and styles change, a perfectly balanced vase or a harmoniously jointed timber frame speaks a universal tongue. Their legacy whispers that true excellence needs no signature, only the willingness to disappear completely into the work, leaving behind nothing but beauty that outlasts memory itself. The quiet revolution of women's hands shaped history in threads and pigments, though their names rarely graced the records. While guild rolls celebrated master carvers and blacksmiths, the workshops buzzing with female artisans were often dismissed as mere domestic crafts, a term that belied the staggering skill behind each stitch and brushstroke. Take the Opus Anglicanum, the gold-wrapped embroidery that adorned medieval European cathedrals. These shimmering vestments, worth more than their weight in silver, were almost exclusively the work of women's collectives in London and Paris. A single cope might feature 10,000 hours of labor, with silk threads so fine they vanished into the fabric, leaving only the gleam of metallic tendrils that seemed to move with the light. These embroiderers didn't just decorate cloth, they engineered it, developing techniques like underside couching to make gold wire flexible enough to drape like liquid over priests' shoulders. In scriptoriums across Europe, nuns wielded brushes with the precision of surgeons. The dazzling illuminations of the Book of Kells, recent pigment analysis reveals lapis lazuli from Afghanistan in its pages, proof that 9th century Irish abbesses traded through vast networks to secure materials. Women like End, the Spanish miniaturist who signed her name boldly in an 11th century manuscript, or Guda, the German nun who painted her self-portrait into a gospel's margins, defied convention by leaving traces of their identities. Their colors weren't just decorative, they were theological. A Virgin Mary's blue robe mixed with ground sapphire wasn't a stylistic choice. It embodied the divine light of heaven itself, each brushstroke a meditation. Ceramics tell a parallel story. In Ming Dynasty China, the imperial kilns of Jingdezhen relied on women's hands for their most delicate porcelain. While men threw pots on wheels, female artisans perfected the underglaze red technique, painting with copper-laced pigments that required split-second timing during firing. A half-second too long in the kiln and the crimson turned ashy gray. Their signature pieces, plates with translucent grapevines, vases with peaches symbolizing longevity, became diplomatic gifts that crossed continents. Yet their names vanished into the kiln smoke, recorded only as the hands of the inner court. This erasure wasn't universal. In Japan's Edo period, Otagaki Rengetsu threw pottery so exquisite that samurai traded swords for her tea bowls. Her works bore poetic inscriptions carved with nail tips, turning functional objects into whispered conversations. Meanwhile, the Kurdish city of Diyarbakir became famous for its female-run ceramic studios, where geometric patterns drawn from memory covered walls in hypnotic precision. These artisans didn't just preserve traditions, they subverted them. A 17th century Armenian tilemaker in Anatolia hid portraits of her daughters between floral motifs, a quiet rebellion in clay. What unites these women across cultures is their mastery of materials that demanded both physical delicacy and profound endurance. Embroidery required sitting motionless for hours, fingers cramping around needles thinner than eyelashes. Illuminators ruined their eyesight grinding pigments for blues that would outlast empires. Potters breathed toxic glaze fumes that shortened lives. The irony is poignant. The very crafts dismissed as women's work were often the most technically demanding, their practitioners pushing materials further than anyone thought possible. A single surviving fragment of Byzantine silk, woven with a complexity modern looms struggle to replicate, holds more innovation than a dozen signed sculptures. Their legacy whispers through the artifacts we've overlooked for centuries. Next time you see a medieval tapestry, look closely. Those perfect stitches aligning like stars in a galaxy weren't accidents. They were the work of hands that turned constraint into genius, threading brilliance through the narrow eye of history's disregard. The true marvel isn't that women created under these conditions, but that they left us beauty so resilient it survived being called insignificant. Disaster didn't just destroy, it distilled. When the Great Fire of London licked its way through the city's timber-framed streets in 1666, it left behind more than ashes. It forged an architectural revolution. The flames exposed the fatal flaw of medieval construction. Wood burned, but brick resisted. Out of the smoke emerged a new breed of artisans masons who mixed mortar with crushed ceramic shards, creating bonds that laughed at fire. Their innovations weren't just practical, they were poetic. The very material that had fueled the inferno recycled into its antidote. walk London's rebuilt streets today, and you're tracing the fingerprints of catastrophe turned catalyst. Meanwhile, across the continent, Vesuvius was writing a different kind of lesson in volcanic ink. Pompeii's frescoes, entombed under pyroclastic flow, should have vanished. Instead, the superheated ash performed an accidental miracle. It vitrified pigments, locking vibrant reds and yellows into walls for millennia. Renaissance artists studying these rediscovered masterpieces didn't just see preserved art, they decoded lost techniques. The Pompeian red that dazzled them wasn't a single pigment but a layered symphony of iron oxides, applied wet on wet with brushes made from sea sponges. The eruption that erased a city inadvertently created the world's most durable art manual. Calamity's curriculum stretched beyond materials. After Lisbon's earthquake of 1755 shattered Baroque excess, artisans embraced restrained neoclassicism, not just because it was sturdier, but because the trauma demanded simplicity. Japanese joinery reached its zenith after typhoons revealed which roof angles could dance with the wind instead of fighting it. Even the humble corbel arch, perfected by Islamic builders after repeated quakes, became a masterclass in redirecting force rather than resisting it. The irony, many disaster-proof techniques were ancient wisdom repurposed. Roman concrete's self-healing properties, forgotten for centuries, are now inspiring resilient infrastructure. The same lime mortars that survived Viking raids are being revived to restore climate-threatened landmarks. Crisis didn't just spur innovation, it became a brutal editor, preserving only the most ingenious solutions. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in what these artisans refused to do. After the fire, London's guilds could have rebuilt faster with cheaper daub and wattle. Instead, they chose the slower, costlier path of brick and stone, not just for safety, but because they'd glimpsed the fragility of cut corners. Their heirs are the Japanese carpenters who still build shrines with flexible joints that sway in quakes, or the Dutch ceramicists reviving volcanic glaze techniques to coat modern buildings in heat-resistant skins. Disaster didn't just force creativity, it revealed craftsmanship's deepest truth. Survival isn't about resisting change, but adapting with it. The next time you see a centuries-old fresco glowing like new or a brick wall that's weathered 1,000 storms, remember, you're not looking at relics. You're seeing the moment artisans stared into the abyss and answered with a chisel, a brush, or a perfectly mixed mortar. The ruins weren't their end, they were the raw material for rebirth. That flint blade resting in a museum case, to modern eyes, it might look like a crude relic until you witness what a master's hand can do with it. Experimental archaeologist Carl Lee once demonstrated how a properly knapped obsidian scalpel could make cleaner incisions than modern surgical steel, its edge honed to a molecular thinness no factory can replicate. The Aztecs performed cranial surgeries with these primitive tools, their barbers turned, surgeons achieving survival rates that baffle historians. This isn't about nostalgia, it's about precision so refined it borders on the invisible. Consider the bow drill, a simple contraption of wood and cord used from ancient Egypt to the Arctic. In the hands of an Inuit carver, it could bore holes in ivory with tolerances tighter than early industrial drills, not through brute force, but through an intimate understanding of torque and rhythm. The secret lay in the details, the angle of the spindle, the blend of saliva and sand as lubricant, the precise moment to ease pressure as the cord twisted. These weren't just tools, they were extensions of the body, calibrated by generations of trial and error. A medieval carpenter's adze might look like a glorified hammer to us, but its curved blade was mathematically shaped to follow the natural arc of a swinging arm, removing wood with the efficiency of a modern planer. The real illusion is in how we define advancement. A Neolithic potter's paddle and anvil technique, pressing clay between a rounded stone and a wooden paddle, could produce vessels with walls thinner than today's mass-produced ceramics. No wheel required, just a tactile mastery of material that industrial automation still can't match. Or take the Japanese kana plane, its blade locked in place by sheer wooden tension. Adjusting it involves tapping the body with a mallet, a method that seems archaic until you watch a master shave translucent curls from cedar without a single motor's whine. What these tools lacked in complexity, they gained in symbiosis with their users. A Viking blacksmith's hammer wasn't just a weight on a stick. Its handle was carved from birch grown on a specific hillside for optimal flexibility. Its head weighted to complement the smith's striking rhythm. Modern power hammers deliver more force, but they can't replicate the way a Norse smith felt the metal's resistance through the haft, adjusting each blow like a musician tuning a chord. Even the humble digging stick used from Aboriginal Australia to the Andes was customized to its owner's height and the soil type, some tapered for root crops, others fire-hardened for rocky earth. This intimate knowledge extended to maintenance rituals we'd consider eccentric today. Mongolian archers stored their composite bows in special cases lined with wolf fat to prevent drying, while samurai swordsmiths slept beside their blades during humidity shifts to monitor temperature changes. A Maasai herdsman's spear wasn't just sharpened. Its iron was ritually treated with ochre and cattle urine to resist rust in the savanna's alkali soils. Every scratch and stain on these tools told a story not of neglect but of hard-won adaptation. The tragedy isn't that these techniques faded, but that we dismissed them as outdated before understanding their brilliance. When British colonists encountered Aboriginal firestick farming using controlled burns to regenerate land, they banned it as primitive, only to watch ecosystems collapse. Now modern forest managers relearn these methods to prevent wildfires. Similarly, the Roman architect Vitruvius documented concrete formulas that self-healed with rainwater, a feature our crumbling infrastructure desperately needs today. Perhaps the deepest lesson lies in humility. That flint blade or bow drill represents more than a tool. It's the physical manifestation of centuries of problem solving, each iteration refined by hands that had no safety nets, no instruction manuals, just the relentless pursuit of doing more with less. When a Maya scribe carved glyphs with a jade chisel or a Sherpa-shaped ice steps with a single curved knife, they weren't limited by their tools, they were liberated by them, free to focus on the work rather than the gadget. In our race to upgrade, we've forgotten that true sophistication isn't in the complexity of the tool, but in the wisdom of the hand that holds it. The sourdough bubbling on a Brooklyn countertop and the hand-forged knife balanced in a Portland workshop aren't just trendy hobbies, they're quiet rebellions. In a world of algorithms and assembly lines, these modern makers are reaching back through centuries to reclaim something we didn't realize we'd lost: the alchemy of patience. That artisanal loaf rising overnight isn't just slower than factory bread. It's a direct descendant of Egyptian sourdough starters that outlived pharaohs. The Japanese-inspired joinery holding up a hipster's bookshelf, it's the same friction-fit genius that's kept Kyoto's temples standing through earthquakes. What looks like nostalgia is actually a radical rediscovery that the slowest methods often yield the deepest mastery. Take the revival of natural dyes. Instagram might showcase indigo vats as photogenic novelties, but today's textile artists are reviving a conversation with nature that predates chemical labs. When a dyer in North Carolina waits weeks for walnut hulls to ferment into rich browns, she's not just avoiding synthetic pigments, she's relearning what Renaissance dyers knew: that the best colors come from collaboration with seasons and soil. Over in Denmark, furniture makers adopting traditional steam bending techniques aren't just rejecting plywood. They're tapping into Viking shipwrights, understanding that wood steamed during a waning moon holds its curve longer. These aren't retro affectations, they're time-tested solutions hiding in plain sight. Even high-tech fields are turning to ancient cues. Silicon Valley engineers study Byzantine mosaics to improve pixel density, while biomimicry architects analyze termite mounds for passive cooling systems. The irony is delicious. Our most advanced innovations often begin by asking, how did they solve this before electricity? A Montreal startup recently patented a self-healing concrete inspired by Roman recipes, while surgeons are testing obsidian scalpels sharper than steel after studying Aztec medical tools. The past isn't a museum, it's a toolbox we're only now learning to fully appreciate. What unites these revivalists, whether they're baking in a farmhouse or coding in a lab, is a shared epiphany. Efficiency isn't always the end point. The medieval scribe who spent a year illuminating a single page knew something our hustle culture forgot. That speed often sacrifices soul. When a luthier hand shaves a violin's soundpost to respond to a specific piece of spruce, or a glassblower gathers molten silica at the exact moment it sings, they're not just making objects. They're keeping alive a language of touch and timing that no machine can fully translate. The true value of handmade isn't just in the product, but in the recalibration of our relationship with time itself. This resurgence isn't about rejecting progress, it's about balance. The same generation that streams music instantly also queues for vinyl records. We video call globally while longing for handwritten letters. Perhaps what we're really crafting is a new hybrid sensibility, where 3D printers share bench space with chisels, and the wisdom of a 13th century stained glass recipe informs solar panel design. The future of making might just lie in this dialogue, honoring the patience of the past while embracing the possibilities of the present. After all, the original artisans were the ultimate innovators. Their workshops weren't stuck in time, they were the cutting edge of their age. Now it's our turn to blend their hard-won wisdom with our tools, not as historical reenactors, but as the next chapter in an unbroken chain of human ingenuity. As we stand in the glow of smartphone screens and drone deliveries, it's easy to assume progress is measured in processing power. But the quiet truth lingers in the grain of a 1,000-year-old wooden joint still holding firm, or the curve of a porcelain bowl that fits your palm like it was molded just for you. These artisans didn't just build objects, they engineered time itself. That Gothic cathedral still standing after 8 centuries of storms. Its secret isn't in the stones, but in the knowing hands that placed each one with a mason's intuition we're only now beginning to quantify. There's a humility in their work that modern hustle culture has forgotten. A 12th century scribe might spend a month perfecting a single illuminated letter, not because he lacked tools, but because he understood that mastery lives in the spaces between strokes. Today's 3D printers can replicate a Ming vase in hours, but they can't replicate the potter's quiet dialogue with the clay, the way his fingers sensed the exact moment the wheel's rhythm aligned with the material's will. Speed was never the point, transformation was, and that's the real challenge they leave us. In an age where we can outsource memory to the cloud and creativity to AI, their legacy whispers a counterintuitive truth. Limitations aren't barriers, they're catalysts. When a Viking shipwright carved a hull with nothing but an adze, or a Navajo weaver spun thread from desert plants, they weren't settling for less. They were proving that innovation thrives when resources are scarce. Their simple tools became extensions of their minds, their bodies fine-tuned instruments no technology could replace. So the next time you pass an antique shop or museum, pause. That samurai sword isn't just a relic, it's a manifesto written in folded steel. That faded tapestry isn't just decoration, it's a mathematical theorem woven in wool. These objects carry more than beauty, they carry a philosophy, one that says greatness isn't about having every tool at your disposal, but about knowing exactly which one to use and when. As the digital age accelerates, their wisdom feels more vital than ever, not as a rejection of progress, but as its conscience. Before you click buy on that mass-produced chair, consider the joinery of a shaker craftsman whose dovetails outlasted empires. Before dismissing hand skills as obsolete, remember the neurosurgeons who train with calligraphy to steady their scalpels. The past isn't asking us to abandon our tools, just to remember that the most advanced technology will always be the human hand guided by an attentive mind. If these stories resonated with you, pass them on. Share this video with someone who thinks history is just dates and dust, or drop a comment about the handmade object that moves you most. Because every time we marvel at a Byzantine mosaic or a Benin bronze, we're not just looking backward, we're keeping alive a conversation across centuries. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring masterpiece